Hi there, Medical Wildcats. I'm Joseph Guggenheim. I'm a 1972 alum of the medical school, and this month my presentation is on Grant Park, which has been called Chicago's front yard. Grant Park is a 319-acre area, but for the sake of today's talk, I'm also going to include the adjacent parks, Millennium Park, Museum Campus, Maggie Daley Park, and Art Institute. You can hardly go from one to the other and notice that there really is no boundary between them. So it is really a continuous area. Let's look at the size of these parks. Grant Park Complex, with these other parks next to it, is about 420 acres. Central Park in New York is basically twice that. And Lincoln Park in Chicago is almost 3 times the acreage of Grant Park. Chicago was incorporated in 1837, and despite the lack of green spaces, the city fathers adopted the term urbs in horto, which is Latin for city and a garden, despite the lack of green space that appears on the city seal as seen on the right. Boundaries and streets began in 1830, and this was based on the Thompson Plan of 1830, which was setting up a city using a rectangular street grid. Lots close to the lake were sold to wealthy residents, and the residents even back then did not want any structure to block their view. In this picture, you can see the north and south branches of the Chicago River at the top, forming the top of the T, and then Lake Michigan is at the bottom where the mouth of the Chicago River is. In the early days, Grant Park was mostly landfill, and you can see in this picture in 1836, Michigan Avenue, which is about midway through the picture. It's the horizontal space labeled faintly Michigan Avenue. And then below that is the landfill. And then below that, you can see the waves to represent the lake. Michigan Avenue used to be the original shoreline. This area was originally deeded to the Illinois and Michigan Canal in 1835. The Illinois and Michigan Canal was the canal that was going to connect the Lake Michigan lake water to the Mississippi River. And they needed to raise money, so the Illinois and Michigan Canal sold this area to the city of Chicago in order to raise money in 1835. The area became a mixture of squatters' homes and a dumping site for more than 40 years. But the area was determined to be a common to remain forever open, clear, and free of any building or other obstruction whatever. Piers were built at the mouth of the Chicago River in the early days, and this caused sand to accumulate on the north side of the river mouth. And this is how Streeterville was largely formed. If you heard my talk a few months ago about George Streeter and Streeterville, Streeter himself claimed that he was responsible for filling in the area, which is now Streeterville, but it was largely the action of the waves that made the Streeterville land form. In 1844, this area became known as Lake Park, or also Lakefront Park, and you can see that as the small triangular area at the pink arrow. Michigan Avenue was within 50 feet of the shoreline. The water would lap up against the lakefront mansions and downtown during storms. The state of Illinois granted the Illinois Central Railroad the right to build out onto the lake with a railroad track trestle if they would also build a breakwater to protect the homes in downtown. The breakwater is at the tip of the red arrow, and you can see the train track at the tip of the green arrow with the landfill that has formed, which is probably a very swampy area at the time. The area just above, which would be west of the train tracks. In 1857, the area where Grant Park now sits was completely underwater. In 1852, the railroad had built a trestle out in the lake and also a breakwater structure. In 1852, the railroad built a trestle 900 feet east of Michigan Avenue and a breakwater a little further east. And you can see in this artist's picture, the people on the landfill, and then above and to the right of that, you can see the train going down the railroad tracks. The Illinois Central Railroad filled about 500 feet of the lagoon. In 1895, the city of Chicago reached an agreement with the federal government to allow filling of the lake approximately 350 feet east of the shoreline, which is where the west lane of the DuSabe Lakeshore Drive is today. Most of the building activity was on the north end of this landfill, and it went from approximately Randolph Street to 12th Street, which is now Roosevelt Road. There wasn't much to the south except the passenger depot, which was built just north of 12th Street. This is a picture of it in 1893. It was finally demolished in 1974. The Art Institute was built on landfill in conjunction with the 1893 Columbian Exposition. Montgomery Ward, the mail order merchant, did not want any structures out in the lake to block his view, but he grudgingly assented to having the Art Institute there because it was considered a work of art and not really a building. In 1901, the city changed the name of the park to Grant Park because there was another lake park, which later became Lincoln Park. In 1908, it was determined that the landfill was complete and only grading and landscape remained. However, the dumping continued. Burnham's 1909 plan of Chicago envisioned more landfill, and he estimated that the dumping of garbage and other refuse would result in 31 additional acres each year. The Olmsted brothers, who designed New York Central Park, were hired to develop a park in this landfill area. However, their design depended on adopting Burnham's plan of Chicago plan, which was largely did not come to fruition. So Edward Bennett was then hired. Bennett was a partner of Burnham, and his office was right across Michigan Avenue from the park, so he could keep an eye on what was going on. His plan called for a more formal design based on the Beaux-Arts principles of symmetry, well-defined paths, and outdoor rooms framed by vegetation, as you can see in the picture on the right of the current status of Grant Park. In the Burnham plan, Congress Street would be the main east-west traffic artery in central Chicago, and it would end in Grant Park. Burnham did not draw any plans, did not realize that there would be any freeways, expressways in Chicago. The Congress Parkway would end at the Field Museum, shown at the tip of the blue arrow. And the park would be the home of many new institutions, including the transplanted Art Institute, the Field Museum, a library, armory, civic center, and a parade ground. All these were blocked by Ward. He had multiple lawsuits against the builders of these buildings, and finally in 1911 he won his case in the Supreme Court. The Burnham plan called for the Field Museum on the Lakeshore Park at the tip of Congress Parkway, and it would be surrounded by 4 statues: Christopher Columbus, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln, as well as Marshall Field with the sign, "Merchant and manufacturer whose benefits naturally follows and completes the work for which the first 3 laid the foundation." So it was no wonder that Montgomery Ward thought that the museum was going to be built to glorify Marshall Field. Ward's office was at 6 North Michigan Avenue, the intersection of Madison and Michigan Avenue. And this is a picture of the building. The building still stands, and it is now a luxury condo. The pyramid on the top has been removed, however. At the time, it was the highest building in Chicago. Ward won his legal battle to keep the park, as determined back in the early 19th century, forever open, clear, and free. Buildings could not be built in the original lakefront park without the unanimous consent of the building owners across Michigan Avenue. Some thought that Ward was not being that altruistic, that he just wanted to have a beautiful view. It doesn't matter. Whatever his motive was, it benefited the city. Due to Ward's victory, future buildings in the park would be underground, but that didn't matter because most of the park was barely above water anyway. So future buildings would be built and then earth heaped over them, and then they would become underground. New uses for the park arose with the passage of time. By 1916, the number of automobiles in Chicago exceeded the number of horse-drawn vehicles for the first time. Underground parking in the area was proposed in 1921 by Mayor Harrison, but was not built for 40 years. Parking in the loop was forbidden, so drivers would park in the wide open spaces of Grant Park, and then they complained that their cars were being stripped or stolen. Airplanes would land and take off in Grant Park until the Winged Foot Express disaster, which was an explosion of a Goodyear blimp over the loop area from a blimp that was docked in was anchored in originally anchored in Grant Park area. The Buckingham Fountain was built toward the south end of the park, and the south end of the park didn't have much in it, so it was built there sort of by default. It was donated by Kate Buckingham in honor of her brother Clarence. Both of them were avid art collectors and philanthropists. They made their money in steel, real estate, and grain elevators. The structure was designed by Edward Bennett, the designer of Grant Park, and also the designer of the Michigan Avenue Bridge that goes over the river. Jacques Lambert was the engineer for the structure, and it was inspired by the Latona Fountain at Versailles. But the Buckingham Fountain is twice the size of that fountain and circulates 3 times more water. Mrs. Buckingham, despite her advanced years, wanted to participate in the design of the fountain, and she wanted the night lighting to resemble soft moonlight in fairyland. It's a beautiful structure both day and night. It recirculates approximately 14,000 gallons of water a minute, and water is drawn from the outside only to replace what's lost by evaporation and wind. The original pumps and motors are still in operation, and John Philip Sousa conducted pomp and circumstance at the dedication in 1927. The museum campus, which is just south of Grant Park proper, was the site of the Century of Progress World's Fair in 1933 and 1934. The museum campus was recognized as a separate park in 1998 with the rerouting of Lakeshore Drive and the creation of green spaces and footpaths. Before that, Lakeshore Drive split at the museum, and the northbound lane was on the east side, and the southbound lane was on the west side. Now both directions are on the west side of Soldier Field and the Field Museum. The museum campus and northerly island were conceived by Burnham and Bennett's 1909 plan of Chicago. The railroad donated the reclaimed land from the park, from the lake. The Field Museum was opened in 1921. Soldier Field in 1924. It's been renovated, but it's the oldest NFL stadium in the league. Northerly Island was completed in 1925, and the Shedd Aquarium and Adler Planetarium were added in 1930. In 1938, the WPA connected Northerly Island to the mainland, and this connection is still in place. So Northerly Island is really an isthmus, not an island now. Meigs Field Airport was opened in 1948, but Richard Mayer M. Daley thought that airplanes taking off and landing so close to the skyscrapers of Chicago were a hazard. So by executive order in the middle of the night, he had the runway destroyed by gouging big X's in it, as you can see in this aerial photograph. It is now a nature preserve with a band shell for concerts. Millennium Park is in the northwest corner of Grant Park, as you can see at the tip of the red arrow, and you can see the black line which denotes the boundaries. It was budgeted to cost $150 million. Eventually, it cost $475 million, but private donations made up $173.5 million of the difference, largely raised by the donations from donors who were contacted by the CEO of the Sara Lee Baking Company. The area was opened in 2004 over parking garages and contains about 24.5 acres. Before that, the land was occupied by the railroad and became a rail yard. Those of us at Mon Vintage may remember what an eyesore this was with these rail yards that you could see from the Lakeshore Drive curve. This S-curve has been redesigned to take out the sharp angles in it. The rail yard in this 1960 picture had been occupied by the Illinois Central Railroad since 1852, and the legal papers said that it had to be used as a rail yard. So the ICRR put a single track and a boxcar down there for years to fulfill the legal requirements, but it was used as a parking lot. Legal analysis of the contracts showed that the ICRR had never actually owned this area, that it had always been the city's. So the city took over it to build Millennium Park. The park now includes the Pritzker Pavilion, a venue for concerts, the Crown Fountain, which is shown on the right here, which is one of the top tourist attractions in Chicago, the Cloud Gate, which is also known as the Bean. It's a 110-ton structure that cost $23 million, and also the Lurie Gardens. There is a McCormick Tribune Plaza and ice rink, which was funded entirely by private donations. There's an ice skating rink here in the winter, and it's used for a dining venue during the warmer months. Maggie Daley Park is just north of Grant Park and just east of Millennium Park. It is 20 acres surrounded by this red boundary. The official ribbon cutting was in 2014. It is named in honor of Maggie Daley, the former City of Chicago First Lady, and it replaced the Richard J. Daley Bicentennial Plaza. The City of Chicago and the Park District planned to renovate the underground garage and outdoor facilities, and they hired Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, which was a landscaping firm. Instead of the formality and rectilinear pattern of Grant Park, the new design, as you can see in the picture, incorporated curvilinear forms and whimsical elements. The plans now include a 3,700 car underground garage and rolling terrain, which is created by these synthetic blocks of EPS geofoam, which is 1/100th the weight of soil. By stacking these like dominoes, as seen in the middle of this picture, or laying them out in small groups, the terrain was converted from a flat lakeside area to a rolling terrain. Other facilities in Maggie Daley Park include tennis courts, an ice skating ribbon, not a rink, but a ribbon, playgrounds, climbing walls, field house, miniature golf, and a picnic area. Also, the block cancer survivor garden is there. But things have not always been rosy for Grant Park. In the late 20th century, the population of Chicago was declining, and Grant Park was left in a state of disrepair. Fountains stopped working, graffiti was rampant, gardens were not maintained, and trees had died due to the Dutch elm disease. Surface parking in the park and at the Field Museum was unsightly. The Hilton Hotel, the structure seen in the background behind this column, even threatened to move their facility because the park had gone into such disrepair. You can see from this picture that was taken recently that the park is now has been renewed as a beautiful structure. Today, the Grant Park has music festivals, Lollapalooza, the Jazz Fest, Blues Festival, Food Festival, the Taste of Chicago, free concerts, movies, and public art, such as this sculpture Agora, and also the NASCAR street races. Millennium Park alone attracts 20 million visitors each year to the park. This is the most visited attraction in Chicago, now exceeding Navy Pier. The renovated park area seems to say, "Cities are back. Come enjoy them." The events in Grant Park, such as the NFL Draft and Lollapalooza, now funnel money into Grant Park, as well as support the other city parks. And very importantly, the park has revived pride in the city. This is a night photograph of the Lollapalooza Festival. I look forward to getting together with you virtually next month. My next month's topic is part 2 of a series on the parks. It will be on Lincoln Park, which was transformed from the city cemetery to the city playground. I look forward to our virtual meeting next month.